I want to start with something simple. A photograph. Not a painting, not an illustration, a photograph. Taken somewhere in the American Midwest, dated approximately 1862. In it, you can see the edge of what appears to be a dense, multi-layered forest stretching to the horizon. But this isn't a wilderness photograph. This is the edge of what was documented by the surveyor who took it as a managed landscape. Trees bearing fruit, understory shrubs heavy with berries, ground cover of edible plants so thick and varied that his field notes, which I found in a county archive in Ohio that almost nobody visits anymore, describe it as, quote, a garden of such abundance as to suggest the hand of a great and ancient civilization. He wasn't writing poetry. He was a government surveyor. These were his professional field notes, and within 40 years that landscape was gone, ploughed under, replaced with monoculture grain fields, and the surveyor's notes were filed in a box in a basement under a subject heading that translates roughly to miscellaneous regional observations. Miscellaneous. That word bothered me for a long time, because nothing about what he described sounds miscellaneous. It sounds like a food system. A complete self-sustaining, extraordinarily productive food system. One that apparently required no visible maintenance, no obvious irrigation, no identifiable farming population tending it. It just existed, and then it didn't. The deeper I went into this question, not the question of what happened to one forest in Ohio, but the question of what happened to all of them, the more that single word kept surfacing in document after document, archive after archive, across continents and centuries. Miscellaneous. Here is what the official historical narrative tells us about pre-industrial food systems. It tells us that before the agricultural revolution fully consolidated in the 18th and 19th centuries, human populations across the world struggled to feed themselves. That famine was endemic. That life was, in the famous phrase, nasty, brutish, and short. That we were hunter-gatherers eking out survival from sparse and hostile landscapes until the genius of industrial agriculture saved us. That's the story. But what if I told you that the actual documentary record, not the interpreted record, not the textbook summary, but the raw primary sources, tell something profoundly different? What if the explorers, surveyors, missionaries and travellers who actually went to these places in the 1700s and 1800s described landscapes so productive, so carefully structured, so biologically diverse that the people who later read their accounts simply didn't know what to do with the information? Let's start with the Amazon basin. When Spanish and Portuguese explorers first penetrated the interior of the Amazon in the 16th and 17th centuries, they reported something that modern academia spent roughly 300 years dismissing as delusion or exaggeration. They reported cities, not villages, not encampments, cities with roads, with agriculture, with populations they estimated in the millions. Francisco de Orellana's chronicles from his 1541 journey down the Amazon describe, and I'm paraphrasing from the original accounts here, continuous settlements for miles, with banks cultivated like gardens, with food in such abundance that the population seemed to want for nothing. The official explanation for why we can't find these cities is that the jungle consumed them, returned to wilderness, left no trace. The official explanation collapses here, because what explorers and anthropologists did eventually find, and what researchers like Anna Roosevelt confirmed through excavations at Marigot Island in the 1990s, was something extraordinary buried in the soil itself, a substance called terra preta, dark earth, man-made soil of such extraordinary fertility that it regenerates itself even today, even when removed and transplanted elsewhere. Soil that has maintained its productivity for what carbon dating suggests may be thousands of years. This is not natural soil, this is engineered soil, and it underlies, we now understand, enormous swaths of the Amazon basin. Patches of it stretch for hundreds of square kilometers. and growing in direct correlation with wherever this soil appears, you find clusters of domesticated or semi-domesticated food plants, Brazil nut trees in formations too regular to be random, cacao, acai palms, pupunha, species after species that we classify as wild, but that appear with unsettling consistency wherever humans once designed the landscape. This raises a simple but critical question. If the Amazon was once home to populations in the millions sustained by engineered soils and managed food forests of continental scale, who built it? When? And why does the official timeline have almost nothing to say about the civilization that would have required? Let me take you back to North America, because what happened there between roughly 1800 and 1900 is one of the most dramatic landscape transformations in recorded history. And it happened so fast that most people alive today don't understand what the continent actually looked like before it happened. The eastern United States was not a wilderness. I want to be precise about this because the wilderness narrative is crucial to the official story, and the official story needs it to remain intact. When European settlers moved through the Ohio Valley, the Mississippi River system, the Carolinas, the mid-Atlantic coast, they were not moving through untouched forest. They were moving through what their own journals describe repeatedly as open park-like woodlands, grasslands interspersed with fruit-bearing trees, nut groves in formations that defied random distribution, persimmon, pawpaw, wild plum, black walnut, hickory, hawthorn, not scattered, not random, arranged. John Bartram, the 18th century botanist, travelled extensively through what is now the American Southeast, and his journals are remarkable not for their scientific classification, though they are scientifically significant, but for the patterns he kept noting and then declining to fully explain. Clearings that seemed maintained without visible maintainers. Fruiting trees in configurations he described as too regular for nature's hand alone. Species assemblages that, he noted with evident puzzlement, seemed to complement each other in the way a thoughtful gardener might arrange a kitchen garden, just at a scale of thousands of acres. Bartram was a careful man, a scientist. He did not speculate wildly, but his notes keep circling this same observation in different locations across different years. And here's the strangest part. Within roughly 60 to 80 years of European settlement in most of these regions, these landscapes had been completely transformed. The open park-like woodlands were gone. The multi-species fruiting forests were gone. The arranged nut groves were gone. Ploughed under, clear-cut, converted to monoculture farms, grazed to bare earth by livestock. And the people who had documented them, the Bartrams, the surveyors, the missionaries, were largely filed away, catalogued, made miscellaneous. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Not in one region, not in two. Across the entire continent, within what amounts to a single human lifetime, a food system of extraordinary productivity and apparent antiquity was replaced with one of industrial monoculture. And we are taught to see this as progress. But progress from what? If the North American evidence were an isolated anomaly, I could perhaps accept the official explanations. Coincidence of geography, climate variation, the particular habits of particular indigenous populations, but the pattern repeats, and it doesn't just repeat, it repeats with unsettling precision. Consider West Africa. When the great 19th century explorers Mungo Park, Richard Burton, Hugh Clapperton traversed the interior of West Africa, they described landscapes that the subsequent colonial agricultural administration seemed almost completely unable to process. Dense multi-story agroforestry systems stretching for hundreds of miles across what is now Mali, Guinea, Senegal, and Nigeria. Not jungle, not wilderness, gardens. The Dogon people of what is now Mali maintained a system of sacred forests and food landscapes that European observers consistently failed to find adequate language for, because their reference point was European agriculture. Single crop, single layer, heavily laboured. What they were looking at was something else entirely. A food forest is not a farm. It is not a garden in the conventional sense. It is a complete ecosystem deliberately assembled in which every layer, the tall canopy trees, the mid-story fruiting trees, the shrub layer, the herbaceous layer, the ground cover, the root layer, is a food source. Animals are part of the system. Water is managed within the system. Nothing is external. Nothing requires constant inputs. The system, once established, feeds itself and everything that lives within it. The evidence suggests this is what existed across West Africa at extraordinary scale, and here is where the colonial record becomes deeply strange. Because the colonial agricultural administrators who arrived in the late 19th century to improve African food production didn't simply fail to recognize what they were looking at, they actively dismantled it. French colonial agricultural policy in West Africa in the 1880s and 1890s systematically cleared what administrators called unproductive bush and replaced it with cash crop monocultures, groundnuts, cotton, palm oil for export. British colonial policy in Nigeria did the same. The unproductive bush they were clearing? Read the field notes of the surveyors who went in first. Read what they describe. It wasn't unproductive. It was extraordinarily productive. It just didn't produce for export. It produced for the people living within it. It produced a surplus so large that some of the early observers noted, with evident bewilderment, that the population seemed to work remarkably few hours to feed themselves, that there were entire seasons in which food simply fell from the trees. Why would you destroy that? Unless you needed people to be hungry. Unless a self-sufficient population was a problem for someone. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm asking why the evidence points in that direction and why nobody in the official historical narrative seems to want to follow that thread. There are places in this world that the official timelines of human habitation simply cannot explain. The Canary Islands. When Spanish explorers made formal contact with the Guanche people of the Canary Islands in the 14th and 15th centuries, they encountered a population living in a landscape of extraordinary cultivated diversity. Terraced hillsides covered in food plants, managed forests of species that, botanists would later note, seem to have been deliberately introduced from multiple regions, not just the African mainland nearby, but varieties that had apparent connections to Mediterranean and even Mesoamerican agricultural traditions. This raises questions that nobody has adequately answered. How does an island population, supposedly isolated, develop a food forest system that incorporates plant species from multiple continents? When did they introduce these species? And who taught them the management system that kept these forests productive for what the available evidence suggests were centuries of continuous harvest? The Guanche themselves were largely eliminated by Spanish colonial violence and disease by the early 16th century. Their land management knowledge went with them, and when Spanish settlers moved in, they found, and here the pattern is by now familiar, a landscape of extraordinary productivity that they proceeded to dismantle and convert to plantation agriculture. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The same sequence, the same arc. Extraordinary productive landscape encountered. Indigenous knowledge holders eliminated or dispersed. Landscape converted. Original system replaced with something less productive but more legible to the colonial economic framework. Not once, not twice, everywhere. Let me tell you about a category of place that I spent a considerable amount of time trying to understand: the restricted forest. In almost every country on Earth, there exist areas of forest that are either heavily restricted to public access, classified under designations that limit research, or simply, and this is the one that keeps me up at night, simply not surveyed, not protected, not studied, not documented, just left. In Russia, vast sections of Siberian taiga remain to this day unsurveyed in any meaningful botanical sense. The official explanation is logistical: too remote, too expensive, too vast to comprehensively document. But within the documented portions of Siberian forest, researchers have found, repeatedly, species assemblages that suggest prior human management, fruiting plants in unnatural distributions, evidence of soil modification, structural characteristics of the forest that resemble managed rather than wild growth. In 2013, a Russian research team conducting a survey in a remote section of the Ural Mountains found what they initially classified as a garden anomaly, an area of approximately 400 hectares in which the distribution of food-bearing plant species was, by their own statistical analysis, essentially impossible by random distribution alone. The probability of the observed species arrangement occurring naturally, they calculated, was less than 1 in several million. Their findings were published in a small regional botanical journal. They were not followed up. The silence was deafening. In China, the areas around the Yangtze River gorges contain ancient forest remnants that the Chinese Academy of Sciences has repeatedly noted show evidence of management dating to periods that predate the officially recognized agricultural civilizations of the Yellow River Basin. Some of these forest remnants contain species that appear, by botanical analysis, to have been deliberately cultivated for food production across hundreds of vertical meters of mountain slope, what you might call a vertical food forest, using the topography itself as a growing structure. These areas are not open to casual research. Access requires permissions that are, in practice, almost never granted to foreign researchers. Why? In what context does a government restrict access to an ancient forest? What is there to protect in a collection of old trees? Unless the old trees aren't the point, unless what they represent, what they imply about who was here before and how they fed themselves, is the sensitive information. And here's where this investigation becomes, to me, truly impossible to ignore. Because I can accept regional anomalies. I can accept that one civilization in one place developed sophisticated food forest systems that were later destroyed. History is full of lost knowledge. What I cannot easily accept is the world-spanning coordination problem. If what the evidence suggests is accurate, if there existed prior to the 19th century and the full consolidation of industrial agriculture, a worldwide network of managed food forests of extraordinary scale and productivity, then their erasure required something remarkable. It required that populations across North America, South America, West Africa, East Africa, South and Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, Europe and Siberia, all simultaneously, within roughly the same 100-year window between 1800 and 1900, abandon or lose their sophisticated land management systems and transition to industrial monoculture. Simultaneously, not regional diffusion over centuries. Simultaneously. The British colonial enterprise was doing it in India and West Africa. At the same time, the American agricultural expansion was doing it in the Mississippi Valley. At the same time, the Russian Empire was doing it across Central Asia. At the same time, the Qing dynasty's collapse was opening Chinese forest territories to resource extraction. Every continent, every colonial system, every domestic expansion, all within the same historical window. What are the odds that this is coincidence? What are the odds that the entire world, independently and simultaneously, decided that ancient, productive, self-sustaining food systems needed to be replaced with labor-intensive monocultures that produced less dietary diversity, required constant inputs, and made populations dependent on supply chains they didn't control? This raises a simple but critical question. Was this a decision, or was it a policy? And if it was a policy, who set it, and why? I'm not answering that question. I want to be clear about that. I don't think I can answer that question from the available evidence. But I think the question needs to be asked because the official history of the 19th century agricultural transition doesn't ask it. It treats the transition as inevitable, natural, the logical outcome of progress. And the deeper I look at the evidence, the more that framing appears to require us to ignore an extraordinary amount of contradictory data. Let me talk about photographs because we have them. The period between roughly 1850 and 1900 is the first era in which we have photographic documentation of landscapes. And what those photographs show, when you look at them carefully, when you look at the edges rather than the subjects in the foreground, is deeply strange. There are hundreds of photographs from this period taken across the American Midwest and South, in which the background landscape shows a density and structural complexity of forest that doesn't match what we're told these regions contained. Official land survey records from the 1830s and 1840s, the General Land Office surveys that systematically map the continental United States prior to settlement. Describe in their witness tree records and vegetation notes a landscape of biological diversity that's almost unrecognizable compared to what those same regions look like today. The witness trees, the trees that surveyors used as reference points at section corners, tell a story of species diversity that modern forest ecologists find remarkable. Multi-species assemblages, old growth characteristics in regions where the official history insists old growth never existed, and embedded among the timber species with a frequency that the survey data doesn't quite acknowledge, but that becomes apparent when you aggregate the records. Food-bearing trees, nut species, fruit species, berry-producing shrubs noted as understory, not forest wilderness, food landscape. And then, within a generation, the photographs from the 1880s and 1890s show the familiar American agricultural landscape. Flat, cleared, monoculture fields to the horizon. The transition happened in 20 to 30 years, in some regions less. How do you clear an ancient food forest system in 20 years? You need capital, you need equipment, you need a coordinated policy that provides both the incentive and the legal framework to clear the land. You need, in other words, exactly what the Homestead Act of 1862 and the subsequent railroad land grants provided, a massive, federally coordinated mechanism for the rapid transformation of existing landscapes. I'm not claiming the architects of the Homestead Act knew they were erasing something important. I genuinely don't know what they knew or didn't know, but the evidence suggests something much larger was operating here than a simple agricultural policy decision. Here is an anomaly that botanical researchers have been quietly noting for decades, and that I find genuinely difficult to explain within the official framework. There are food-producing plant species distributed across the world in patterns that cannot be explained by natural dispersal mechanisms. The pawpaw tree, Asimina triloba, produces a fruit of remarkable nutritional density. It is native to and currently found in a very specific swath of the eastern United States. Its seeds cannot be dispersed by wind. They are too large and heavy for most bird species to carry significant distances. The animal dispersers that botanists typically credit with its historical spread, mastodons, giant ground sloths, went extinct roughly 10,000 years ago. So who spread the pawpaw across its current range? The official answer is indigenous peoples, and that answer is almost certainly correct. But it implies something that the official answer doesn't fully reckon with. It implies sustained, intentional, landscape-scale horticultural management across what is now the entire eastern United States for thousands of years by populations we consistently describe as hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers don't plant orchards across a continent. What does? Similar anomalies appear in the Amazon. Similar anomalies appear in the Pacific, where food species distribution across island chains suggests a level of intentional botanical transfer that implies maritime networks of a sophistication and duration that don't fit neatly into the official archaeological timeline. In Southeast Asia, the durian tree, a food source of extraordinary caloric density, appears in what ethnobotanists have noted are semi-managed wild populations across Borneo, Sumatra, and the Malay Peninsula that show evidence of historical cultivation and intentional planting extending back further than any recognized agricultural civilization in the region. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Everywhere there are anomalous food species distributions, there are also anomalous soil characteristics. And everywhere there are anomalous soil characteristics, there are early historical accounts, pre-colonial accounts, 18th and early 19th century accounts of extraordinary landscape productivity. And everywhere there are accounts of extraordinary landscape productivity, there is a clean break, a transition, a moment in which the records shift from describing abundance to describing something that has been replaced. This is the question I keep returning to. Not whether these food forests existed, the evidence that they did at various scales across multiple continents seems to me genuinely compelling. Not whether they were destroyed, the chronological record of landscape transformation makes that fairly clear. The question is, why forbid the knowledge of them? Because that is what appears to have happened. And I want to be careful here because I'm describing something subtle and systemic rather than a single dramatic event. The knowledge of how to establish, manage and harvest a perennial food forest, the specific botanical and ecological knowledge of how to assemble a system that feeds itself and the people within it indefinitely with minimal labour from a fraction of the land area that conventional agriculture requires. This knowledge is not in our agricultural universities. It is not in our farming manuals. It is not in our cultural inheritance of food production. We have rediscovered it painstakingly in the last 50 years. People like Robert Hart in England, who pioneered what he called forest gardening in the 1960s and 70s, working from first principles, from observation of natural systems, from fragments of older traditions that survived in marginal places, essentially had to rebuild the knowledge from scratch. Why from scratch? If this knowledge was, as the evidence suggests, widespread and culturally embedded across much of the world in the 18th century and earlier, if it was not esoteric or elite knowledge, but the everyday agricultural practice of millions of people across multiple continents, why does it not appear in the conventional agricultural tradition that followed? Why did we not inherit it? Agricultural knowledge is among the most tenaciously transmitted of all human knowledge. Farming families pass technique across generations over centuries. The specific details of how to grow wheat, how to manage a vineyard, how to rotate crops, this knowledge survived wars, famines, plagues, and migrations. But the knowledge of how to establish a food forest? Gone. Comprehensively, worldwide, almost completely gone within the span of a single century. Not faded, not evolved into something else, not absorbed into a new tradition. Gone. I keep coming back to this word. And I keep asking what, in the historical record, it takes to make a knowledge tradition go. Gone. The answer, historically, is you have to make the people who carry it go first. There are, right now, forests on this planet that cannot be easily accessed. Some are restricted by governments for stated reasons: biodiversity protection, national security buffers, indigenous land sovereignty. Some are restricted by the simple economics of remoteness. And some, and this is the category I find most interesting, are restricted in ways that don't have a stated reason. Places that appear on maps with designations that don't quite make sense. Research stations in forest zones where the research outputs don't match the apparent scale of the facility. Military buffer zones in locations where no obvious military interest exists. I'm not claiming these places contain something specific. I'm noting that the pattern of restriction tends to cluster in regions that, when you cross-reference historical surveys and early explorer accounts, correspond to areas described as having extraordinary food landscape productivity prior to the 19th century. The correspondence is not perfect, it's not a one-to-one map, but it's frequent enough to be interesting. In New Zealand, areas of ancient podocarp forest are some of the oldest surviving forest ecosystems in the southern hemisphere, containing species that predate any official Polynesian settlement timeline, are protected under access restrictions that go considerably beyond what biodiversity conservation would require. Researchers who have worked in adjacent areas have noted, in what tends to be fairly understated academic language, that the food-producing characteristics of these forests are underexplored. In central India, the biodiversity hotspots of the Eastern Ghats contain forests with food plant assemblages that local tribal communities maintain are ancient, pre-agricultural, pre-Hindu, pre-everything in the official timeline. The Indian Forest Service has classified significant portions of these areas as restricted reserve forests. Access for independent botanical research is limited, not impossible. Limited, and in limited access, information has a way of moving slowly. I want to end not with a conclusion because I don't have one, and I think anyone who claims to have a clean conclusion to this particular body of evidence is not being honest with you, but with a feeling. The feeling I get when I sit with all of this. Because here is what the accumulated evidence seems to suggest, taken together, not definitively, not provably, but suggestively, in the way that patterns in evidence suggest before the final documents are found. It suggests that for a very long time, longer than our official histories acknowledge, human beings knew how to feed themselves extraordinarily well, from landscapes that fed them back, from systems that grew more productive over time rather than less, from forests that were not separate from civilization but were the very substrate of it. It suggests that this knowledge was not primitive, not accidental, not the lucky result of living near naturally productive land. It was sophisticated, intentional, ecological in a way that our most advanced modern agronomy is only beginning to rediscover. It suggests that this system, worldwide, ancient, productive, self-sustaining, was replaced rapidly and comprehensively across the entire planet within a window of historical time that is very short given what was replaced. And it suggests that the replacement produced something that by almost every ecological and nutritional metric is inferior to what it replaced. More labour intensive, less diverse, more fragile, more dependent. Why would you do that? Why would you replace something ancient, productive and self-sustaining with something that requires constant inputs, degrades its own substrate over time, produces less nutritional diversity, and makes the people who depend on it structurally vulnerable? I keep asking this question. I keep not getting a satisfying answer from the official record. What I get instead is silence, miscellaneous filings, underexplored, access restricted, not within the scope of this survey, and somewhere in the Amazon basin the terra preta regenerates itself, as it has for however many thousands of years, and the Brazil nut trees stand in their impossibly regular formations, and the cacao and the acai cluster where human hands once placed them, growing without instruction, waiting in the patient way of trees, in the abundance that someone once knew how to build. And somewhere in an Ohio County archive, in a box labelled miscellaneous, a government surveyor's field notes describe a garden of such abundance as to suggest the hand of a great and ancient civilization. The deeper I went into this question, the more I became convinced that the most important thing about it isn't what happened to the food forests, it's what we don't remember that we lost. Because the evidence suggests something much larger than a history of land use, it suggests a history of forgetting. And I don't know who benefits from that forgetting. I don't know if the forgetting was deliberate or systemic or simply the massive indifferent consequence of a particular kind of economic transition rolling across the earth. But I know what the evidence shows. I know what the surveyors wrote before anyone told them to stop writing things like that. I know that the soil in the Amazon still feeds itself and the trees still grow in the patterns of someone else's intention, and the knowledge of how to do what they once did has to be reconstructed painstakingly by people who have never seen it work at the scale it apparently once worked. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The question isn't where the food forests went. The question, the one that stays with me, is whether what replaced them was chosen or imposed, and whether we would make the same choice if we had one.